Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Taking on the Islamic State, or an excuse to fight whoever you wish. Each member of Washington's coalition of the reluctant has its own agenda, and it's rarely directed against this terrorist group. It's not surprising we're being told destroying the Islamic State will take a very long time. To CrossTalk the Islamic State, I'm joined by my guest, Brian Becker, in Washington. He is the national coordinator for the Answer Coalition. Also in Washington, we have Ubay Shabander. He is a senior advisor to the Syrian opposition. And in London, we cross to Reverend Nadim Nasser. He is director of the Awareness Foundation. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Okay, Brian, I'd like to go to you in Washington first here. Let's take a look at over the last 13 years here of American involvement and its allies in the greater Middle East. And I see only two conclusions here. Things always get worse, and there's even greater blowback coming to the West. How do you react to that?
Well, it is insane in one way, and I think it's important to be able to step back and look at the big picture to see we don't have to look for conspiracy theories. We can actually see what has happened over the last 11 years to sort of make heads and tails out of what's going on. What we do know now is that the United States, without the authorization of the United Nations and without the authorization of the Syrian government, has intervened militarily into Syria and has proclaimed that it intends to do so for a long time. At the same time, because of the situation in Iraq, the new government has invited the United States to come into Iraq and again to endlessly stay there, which will mean the Pentagon doing what it really wanted to do, which is to create permanent military bases in Iraq. When we look at the big picture of what's happened, the United States government, through its invasion and then occupation strategy, fractured Iraq. It fractured it on ethno-sectarian lines. Then it carried out the bombing of Libya and the destruction of a secular nationalist government. And then it began arming and funding through its proxies and directly with the CIA, armed opposition groups against another secular nationalist government in Syria. And after it destroyed Iraq, it created space for groups like the Islamic State to take root in Iraq, someplace that they had never had a strong position. In the case of Libya, you had armed Islamic extremist fighters who were, with the help of NATO, significant fundamental help from NATO, toppled the government there. And then those weapons and those fighters migrated to Syria. In Syria, of course, you had legitimate, valid grievances by parts of the Syrian population, but those were quickly overwhelmed by the force of the Islamic State and other Islamic extremist forces. And then we have the U.S. government and its proxies like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, funding and fueling those forces. Now the United States has, maybe as a consequence, the unintended consequences of its policies, the pretext to go in and do what it really wants to do, which is to show it will be the dominant military power in this resource-rich part of the world.
Okay, Ubay, in Washington, do you agree with that synopsis? It's quite succinct. Go ahead.
I completely disagree. I mean, let's be very clear here. The Syrian opposition forces, the Free Syrian Army, were the ones that fired the first shot against the Islamic State extremists beginning in January. In fact, the only force on the ground in Syria today, particularly in northern and eastern Syria, has actually pushed ISIS back from multiple strategic provinces in Syria, has been the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian opposition forces. There is no question that ISIS today is a true global threat. It is a threat to the Syrian people. It is a threat to the Iraqi people. And it is a terrorist organization that has made clear that it has global ambitions to include striking Europe and potentially North America. On the ground in Syria today, the Syrian opposition forces are engaged in a frontline war against ISIS, particularly in the city of Aleppo. In northern Syria, Free Syrian Army forces are fighting side by side, shoulder to shoulder with Kurdish resistance forces against ISIS. This is ultimately a win-win scenario. This is not only a fight for the Syrian people. This is a fight ultimately in the interest of the international community as a whole. The coalition that we're seeing that's been formed by the United States, by its Western allies, and by its Arab allies in the region is launching attacks against ISIS today. No one is talking about an invasion. No one is talking about boots on the ground, as it were, in Syria today. There are local fighters on the ground that are resisting the Islamic State, and those are the Free Syrian Army and the Kurdish forces on the ground that are being supported by the international community.
Okay, let's go to London. Reverend Nadim, it seems that force is what's created ISIS here with bringing in so much weaponry, training, money, again, stressing these Gulf countries that are not always in lockstep with its Western allies here. It's violence begetting violence. Go ahead.
I think the man from the opposition, Mr. Shahbandar, is very much delusioned. I think, and here I insist that what I'm going to say has nothing to do whether I'm supporting the regime or not. I'm not. And it has nothing to do that because in Syria, if you criticize the oppositions, then you are automatically understood you are an ally with the regime. This is rubbish. It's not. It doesn't mean that at all. But I think the oppositions. I have to ask the oppositions who allowed those extremists in the first place to come to Syria. Wasn't it you, the oppositions? And second, you failed dismally to capture the imagination of the Syrians, what you call revolution. It was not a revolution. It was a fiasco. It was the abortion of anything to do with revolution. What you messed up in Syria was much more than the regime could have ever done. And also, you failed to send the right messages, especially to the minorities, the numerical minorities, because we as a minority, we belong to the very fabric of the society. You failed to send the right messages to say to the minorities, you are respected, you are welcome in this place. You welcomed those fighters.
As opposed to the Assad regime, that, by the way, continues to launch strikes, airstrikes and artillery strikes against both Christian towns and against Muslim towns. Look, to the answer to the question of who brought ISIS into Syria, it's a very clear answer, and that is the Assad regime,
the question,
the security services.
Just
well
one
before
second.
the revolution
Let me finish my point.
Syrian military intelligence was supporting Al-Qaeda in Iraq,
let me finish my point.
in eastern Syria, bringing foreign fighters, hundreds of foreign fighters, into Iraq. That was well before 2011. By the Assad regime and by Syrian security apparatus.
All right, they went today. Let's go back to London and finish your point, please.
This argument, this argument is old and it's not working. You picked the arm against the regime instead of continuing your peaceful movement, which could have captured the imagination of the people. We were fed up with the corruption. We were fed up with the lack of freedom. We wanted the change, but you did not bring any change.
All right, I want to go back. Gentlemen, I want equal time for everyone here. Okay, please, I'm sorry, but equal time. Brian, let me go back to you. We see what's happening here is these very strange political relationships because, have the Kurds and Turkey. You have the United States supporting the Kurds here. I mean, this is a recipe. It's a cocktail to continue this chaos all through the region. I mean, the lack of Iran's involvement in this, and I'll even say Russia's involvement in this, would be very pragmatic, but we don't hear pragmatic voices. Go ahead.
Well, yes, there are many layers of contradictions in the relationships. Each of the countries, the ruling elites in each of the countries and their own foreign policy establishment have their own agendas and their own strategic thrust in the region. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, they each have their own ambitions. Those have become a major factor in what's happened in Syria. But behind it is the more dominant narrative, I think, which is what is the United States' goal in all of this? And you can see that there have been many blunders, and I think we should emphasize that there have been strategic blunders based on small thinking by U.S. foreign policymakers, but those blunders fit a pattern, which is to find different mechanisms for the exercise of U.S. domination in the region. Now we have, and what's emerging is that the so-called Free Syrian Army, which is a fantasy and a fiction, is being reshaped because it can't defeat the Assad government, which was its assigned task by the West and the regional allies. It's being reconfigured. The United States government has just authorized $500 million to retrain and rebuild the so-called Free Syrian Army so that it will become a U.S. mercenary army. And without U.S. interference, direct interference, and using the U.S. government's Air Force as its Air Force, the Free Syrian Army has no possibility of defeating either the Islamic State or the Assad government. And in fact, many of the Free Syrian armies, so-called, have defected and are now part of the Islamic State.
All right,
That's why they have so many U.S. weapons.
Let me jump in here. I'm going to go to Obai. Give him the last word before we go to the break. Obai, it was President Barack Obama that called the moderates a fantasy. That's the word that Brian is using. Go ahead, respond to that.
Look, there's no question about it. The Free Syrian Army is the force on the ground that ISIS fears the most. Multiple senior ISIS commanders and al-Qaeda extremists have been killed by the Free Syrian Army. In fact, ISIS fears the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian opposition forces on the ground to such an extent that has attempted to assassinate at least 3 leading Free Syrian Army commanders. This is a force on the ground that is viable. It is taking the fight to the extremists. It is also taking the fight to the Assad regime. Just last week, the Free Syrian Army successfully liberated a major joint regime and Russian military base in southern Syria. They are there. They are on the ground. They are protecting the Syrian people against the Assad regime.
All right, gentlemen, I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Islamic State. Stay with RT. Okay, Nadim, I'd like to go back to you in London. I think if we look at least the last 14 years here and the use of force in the Middle East, it doesn't destroy terrorism, it actually just generates it. Why do they think it's going to be different this time? Go ahead.
The question that nobody is answering and nobody is daring to answer is who created ISIS? And what is really ISIS is about. The ethnic, the sectarian cleansing in Syria and Iraq, the displacement and the killing of Christians and the Yazidis and all the minorities. It has an aim. We are heading towards separation and division in the Near East. And ISIS prepared the way to demographically changing the Near East. So the sectarian division could be possible. I do not believe a second that the Western countries are innocent because they were a strong force behind creating ISIS in the area in order to restructure the area demographically.
Okay, Obai in Washington, do you want to react to that? Because it really is a product of Western meddling. Go ahead.
Again, I completely disagree.
Yes,
I think, though, it is important to look at the root cause of ISIS in Syria and in Iraq today. The root cause here is the environment that created ISIS, which was the security apparatus of the Assad regime and the war that the Assad regime continues to wage against the Syrian people.
Stop using the regime
now,
every
ISIS
time
existed
as a hook.
in eastern Syria on the border in Iraq since well before 2011. It wasn't until ISIS went in and started fighting Syrian opposition forces and the Free Syrian Army, while the Assad regime stood back and allowed ISIS to move in. It's very important to remember that ISIS began expanding in areas that were liberated from the Assad regime and were prioritizing the fight against the freedom fighters in Syria today, not against the Assad regime. The Assad regime's Air Force was launching barrel bombs against civilians in Syria while allowing the ISIS's headquarters in the city of Raqqa to continue to exist unmolested. This is a very clear indication of tacit, if not direct, support and coordination between the Assad regime, his security apparatus, and ISIS extremists.
Okay, Brian, but you could say...
Why did you support Jabhat al-Nusra? Why did you support Jabhat al-Nusra? Why did you allow the weapon of extremists,
no one is supporting Jabhat al-Nusra. Again,
to join you?
Let's look back at the realities on the ground. Al-Qaeda has released multiple fatwas against the Syrian opposition coalition and against the Free Syrian Army. I would invite you to check your history.
All right, gentlemen, I want to go to Brian in Washington, D.C. Okay, Brian, but you know, the origins here, they're quite simple. It's called 2003, illegal invasion of Iraq. That's the origin, direct origin at least. Go ahead.
Exactly. There are many secondary factors, but the Iraq and Syria were secular, nationalist, unitary states. The United States, when it destroyed the government in Iraq, the Saddam Hussein government, it disbanded its army, it illegalized Baathism, and it decided to create, on an ethno-sectarian basis, a new government. There was a Kurdish wing, a Shiite wing, a Sunni wing. In other words, the unitary character of Iraq was destroyed both as a governing strategy and then as a way to defeat the opposition once it became undefeatable through other methods. That was started in 2005, 2006. So Iraq was destroyed. And then the United States destroyed Libya. But here in Syria, which shares a contiguous border with Iraq, the United States government did essentially the same thing because it had targeted the Assad government for regime change. It didn't care a year ago. Let's remember, Peter, a year ago when Obama and Kerry were almost on the verge of bombing Syria, they didn't talk about Islamic State. They talked about the Assad government as the only principal target. That was just 13, 14 months ago. That means at the time that the Islamic State was cutting off the heads of Syrian soldiers, massacring Shiites, the United States government didn't give a damn about that because they were working with the Islamic State as they were working with the Free Syrian Army. Then the Islamic State has its own agenda and became a strategic threat to some assets like Baghdad and the Kurdish regional government in Iraq and perhaps Jordan. And so the U.S., in order to save face and to blunt their offensive, went on a counteroffensive. But having done that, they now can do what they really wanted to do, which was create military bases in Iraq and enter Syria without dispute. And ultimately, they will not only attack the Islamic State, but again target the Assad government, which is still on their radar for destruction because they said Assad must go, so Assad must go. The empire has spoken. They have these double agendas. Fundamentally, this is the U.S. responsibility. The blood of the Syrian people and the Iraqi people and the division of those countries, the blood of those people is on the hands of those in Washington. First Bush and Cheney, and later Obama and Kerry.
As opposed to the Assad regime that is actually launching ground-to-ground missiles on schools and villages on a daily basis. Now, that is who really has the blood on their hands of the Syrian people. Look, the revolution, the Syrian people rose up against the Assad regime, not on behest of the United States or any country in the world.
What revolution has America? What revolution has
democracy in
Syria? What revolution has the U.S.?
It was not the United States.
The U.S. government doesn't fund revolutions.
5 barrel bombs on a daily basis against Aleppo. Tens of thousands killed of these barrel bombs.
Can I ask my colleague? Can I ask the other guest?
Gentlemen, quiet down. You're talking over each other. You're talking over each other. No one can hear you. Brian, you want to ask a question? Please do. Simple question.
I want to ask you a question. Where, except in Nicaragua, say when the United States funded the Contra army to overthrow the Sandinista, where else does the United States government fund Contra armies? Now, they've just decided they're going to spend $500 million as the beginning budgetary item to fund and finance and train the Free Syrian Army. Why would the U.S. government do that if for a progressive purpose? The United States government in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Israel and Palestine, it doesn't fund progressive revolutionary causes. This is not a revolution. This is an exercise of U.S. domination through the intermediary of a mercenary army. That's what the Free Syrian Army.
Okay, answer the question, please do.
Completely incorrect. For 6 months, the Syrian people, Syrian civilians, students, Christians, Muslims, Alawites were marching peacefully against the Assad regime. They were met by artillery strikes, they were met with machine gun fire, and they were met with tank fire. For 6 months, Syrian civilians and students were rising up for their rights while they were being bombarded by the Assad regime. Whole towns and villages have been completely wiped out by Assad's Scud missiles, by his chemical arsenal.
But can I ask you a question? Let me ask you.
That is what's created the environment for ISIS and for extremists on the ground today.
Let me ask you. Okay, let me ask you a question, okay? What is worse in your mind, the Assad regime or ISIS?
Good question.
Well, I think there are two sides of the same coin, frankly. I completely agree with Secretary Kerry when he said that the Assad regime is the primary magnet for terrorism in Syria today. And the reality is that this is not a secular nationalist regime. On the surface, the Assad regime appears to be secular, appears to be anti-terrorism. But again, who was bringing in the foreign fighters into Iraq from 2006 to 2009? It was the Assad regime and Syrian military intelligence. This is a regime that has played a very cynical and cruel game by releasing extremists.
You know what?
From
You know what, gentlemen? It seems to me there's a lot of cynicism. There's a lot of cynicism on a lot of sides right here. Like Turkey, open door to terrorists flooding into Syria. Nadim, go ahead. You want to jump in? Please do.
Yes, because I think what you're saying, Mr. Shahbandar, is you are in a cuckoo land. What is happening in Syria? When you supposed to be freeing areas in Syria, we suffer. The minorities, we suffer under your regime much more than the Assad regime. The rhetoric, even your troops are named by radical Islamic names, which exclude a lot of the Syrian people. What are you talking about? Do you think that America and the Western countries are helping you freely because they love the Syrian people? You are delusioned. Nothing is free. I was meeting with the Foreign Office here, and one of the junior ministers said, Father Nadim, there is no friendship in politics. There are only interests. And the United States has interests in the area, not because they want democracy for the Syrian people.
And really, you think the Assad regime has the best interests of minorities in Syria? You really, truly think the Assad regime has the best interests of minorities, ethnic minorities in Syria today? That is not true. He is playing with their lives. It's that cynical game that he continues to play. And the reason why the Assad regime is sponsoring extremists.
Go ahead, Reverend.
I come from Latakia. I come from Latakia. And the Alawites and the Christians and the Muslims, now in the middle of the war, I just came back from Syria last week. We are living almost a normal life. What have you provided for us?
Okay, gentlemen, we're almost out of time. I want to go to Brian because we're almost out of time here. Okay, Brian, what is the next step here? Because it just seems to me that they say this could last for 30 years, but they're certainly making that possible with these very strange alliances and contradictions in the region. Go ahead.
Well, yes, you see Leon Panetta, who is both the CIA director and the Secretary of Defense, who is now retired. He's going around sort of criticizing Obama and proclaiming that there will be a 30-year war. Hillary Clinton, who's going to run for president, is also echoing this will be a long war. George Bush and Dick Cheney, that was their slogan, endless war. So what is it really all about? Ultimately, for the United States, which, as the Reverend said, has interests but not really permanent allies, their interests are to dominate a region where 2/3 of the world's oil is, a resource-rich region. They'll do it through monarchies, they'll do it through dictatorships, they'll do it through the Free Syrian Army, but their goal is to dominate. Ultimately, that will breed more violence, escalating the cycle of violence. It's not about peace and it's not about freedom. It's about imperial domination over this region.
Okay, on that point there, many thanks to my guests in Washington and in London, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, CrossTalk rules.